ever feel a room's temperature change before anyone says a word? That's what it felt like the morning I got called into Marcus's office. The air had that heavy, over-conditioned chill, the kind that makes your skin prickle even before the bad news lands. I'd been at Lornell consulting for 8 years, and I'd seen that walk before. Someone from HR standing just a little too close to the door, pretending to be casual. When Marcus said, "Rachel, could we have a quick chat?" I already knew. Still, I smiled. I always smiled because that's what women like me do in offices like that. "Rachel," Marcus started, adjusting his tie like it was choking him. "You've been a real asset to this team. No one's questioning that." That's the preamble, I thought. The kind that comes right before a knife. But he continued, "There have been some comments about your leadership style. A few of the newer staff feel you're maybe a little too detail-focused, hard to delegate around." "Detail-focused," I repeated, keeping my tone even. "That's what we built our client satisfaction metrics on, Marcus." He smiled the way people smile when they want you to stop talking. Of course. It's just, well, for the sake of team cohesion, we think it might be best if you transition into a more supportive role for a while." "Supportive," I echoed. That word hung between us like smoke. He didn't say demoted. But the HR rep standing by the door already had a new contract folder in her hand. By the time I walked out, I could feel eyes on me over monitors, through glass partitions. No one asked what happened, but everyone knew. In our office, bad news travels faster than coffee refills. "Hey, Rachel," Mark called out as I passed his desk. He was one of my project leads, mid-30s, all swagger and cologne. "Everything good?" "Perfect," I said, sliding my badge to unlock my new workspace. 2 rows down, smaller desk, no door. "Cool," he smirked. "Heard something about you getting to focus more on detail now." "Sounds right up your alley." Laughter from 2 nearby desks. Quiet, but not quiet enough. I didn't answer. I just sat down and started moving files. People assume revenge begins with rage. Mine began with silence. At first, I did exactly what they wanted. Took the lesser role, handled support tasks, and watched them run their shiny new projects like they'd reinvented management itself. Mark strutted around calling himself acting team lead. He held meetings that were mostly monologues. He liked phrases like "let's circle back" and synergy streams. He also liked to copy my old process templates and slap his initials on them. One day I overheard him say, "Rachel's good at paperwork, not strategy." There's a difference. I went home that night and opened my old drive folder, the one only I knew how to access. It contained every single process map, every template, every automation script that kept the whole department's deadlines from imploding. And I stared at them, thinking about how fragile everything actually was. The funny thing about being demoted is it gives you time. And with time, you start noticing things other people miss. how the shared client tracker I built hadn't been updated since I left it. How no one was checking the error logs for the automation bot that routes proposals. How the interns were suddenly emailing me questions like, "Hey Rachel, do you remember how the budget sync works?" I answered every one of them politely. At first. Then I stopped. The first time a project went wrong, I wasn't even in the meeting. I just heard the muffled sound of voices rising through the glass wall. "Who changed the delivery timeline? I thought you did. Where's the client folder? It's missing." I kept typing, expression neutral. A few minutes later, Mark stormed over. "Rachel, quick question," he said. "Do you still have access to the old phase tracker template? Ours seems to be glitching." Glitching? I looked up with what I hoped was just the right amount of innocence. "That's odd. It was working fine last time I used it." "Yeah, well, now it's throwing off the dates. Deliverables got sent to the wrong client folder." I tapped my chin. "That's strange. Maybe check your permissions. Sometimes when someone changes ownership without syncing the access list." He cut me off. "We didn't change ownership." I smiled. "Then I'm sure it's just a minor bug. You'll figure it out." He stared at me for a second too long, then walked away. That was the moment I knew he suspected. But suspicion isn't proof. In the weeks that followed, things unraveled faster. Missed calls, corrupted files, invoices sent twice. None of it intentional, not exactly. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I just stopped being the invisible safety net I'd always been. And when a system built on invisible labor loses its foundation, it doesn't fall loudly. It sags until one day it gives out completely. Then came the quarterly review. Marcus looked exhausted. Mark looked defensive. And I looked calm. "Rachel," Marcus said, rubbing his temples, "you've been here a long time. You know these systems better than anyone. What's going on with the team?" I shrugged lightly. "Growing pains, I suppose. Happens when there's a change in leadership." Mark shot me a glare. "We're fixing it," he said quickly. "It's just, she used to handle all the little back-end stuff, and now—" Marcus interrupted. "The little back-end stuff that kept our top clients happy." Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. I sat back, hands folded. "I'm happy to help however you need, Marcus. Just tell me where I'm most useful." He nodded slowly, eyes flicking between us. That was the beginning of the turn. But revenge isn't about taking back power all at once. It's about letting people walk themselves into the hole they dug for you. Over the next few weeks, I watched Mark scramble. I watched him take shortcuts, blame others, and boast in meetings that he had it all under control. He didn't, and deep down, I think he knew it. Because sometimes, when you've laughed at the wrong person, you start to hear echoes you can't explain. And that was before the email, the one that changed everything. The week started like any other, or at least it seemed that way. But by Tuesday afternoon, The first real sign that everything was unraveling hit me like a cold draft through an open window. I was sitting at my smaller desk, quietly reviewing a client's quarterly report. Nothing fancy, just routine reconciliation work, when I heard the first raised voices from the team pod. Seriously, how does this even happen? I looked up and saw Mark leaning over a junior analyst's desk, red in the face. The kid, barely a year in the company, looked like he wanted to vanish. "What do you mean? How does this happen?" Mark snapped. "This report was due yesterday. We've got a client call in an hour, and you're telling me you're missing data." The analyst stammered. I don't know. I followed the template Rachel left in the shared drive." Mark froze for a fraction of a second, and I caught it from my corner. That flash of recognition that I had anticipated. Yeah, fine," Mark muttered, trying to regain composure. "Well, figure it out, fast." I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. I just kept typing, pretending my screen was the most absorbing thing in the room. The kid scrambled to make sense of the sheets, checking columns, formulas, everything I had painstakingly set up months ago. Except he was missing a step, one tiny but crucial step I always double-checked when I ran the reports. And just like that, the cracks started to show. By mid-morning, another problem had surfaced. A client email sent to the wrong department. Mark was in the conference room, packing like he had it all under control. "I don't understand," he muttered aloud, mostly to himself. "We've gone over this. How did this even happen?" A few of the other team leads were muttering too, but no one dared speak loudly. I watched silently, taking mental notes. Not because I needed to gloat, but because I was fascinated. This wasn't chaos for chaos' sake. It was predictable, systematic, and it all stemmed from the simple fact that the person who had held everything together was no longer in the team's daily orbit. Rachel, one of the interns, called timidly, poking her head over the partition. "Do you know what went wrong with the client tracker?" I thought we were following the new setup. I smiled lightly, just enough to reassure without giving away any hint. "I'm sure you're very close. Check the last 3 updates and see if any formulas have been modified. That's usually where these things start." She nodded nervously and scurried back to her desk. By the end of the day, Marcus had called a meeting. Mark walked in, trying to carry his usual confident posture, but you could see it cracking around the edges. "Okay," Marcus said, rubbing his forehead. "I've noticed some issues this week. Let's go over them carefully. Mark, can you explain the delivery errors?" Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't know where to start, and the team's silence made it worse. He began, voice tight. "There were a few mistakes. Some of the templates didn't sync properly, but I'm handling it." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Templates didn't sync. That's unusual, especially since these are standard, tried and true setups." The room went quiet. Everyone glanced at me, half expecting me to speak. I stayed silent, because that was the point. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, accusatory, the kind of silence that makes someone squirm when they know they're in over their heads. Over the next couple of days, the pattern repeated. Missed deadlines, emails sent to the wrong clients, budgets miscalculated, internal confusion over who was supposed to do what, all minor on their own, but piling up in a way that made the office feel like it was slowly tilting. I watched Mark spiral quietly. He would check in with Marcus, try to cover mistakes, blame interns, even call me occasionally with questions, all under the guise of just making sure I understand the setup. I answered, but only enough to nudge him further into his own mistakes. A misplaced decimal here, an overlooked checkbox there, things I had always monitored, but now left untouched. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't sabotage. It was letting reality work its way back to the truth. By the end of the week, whispers started circulating. Is Rachel doing something? No, she would. Maybe she's just disengaged. But things didn't fail like this before she left the team. I overheard it all carefully, calmly, letting tension build like water behind a dam. And then came the first client complaint. A routine check-in with one of our top-tier clients had gone wrong. Miscommunication, missed follow-ups, and incorrect data were sent in the same bundle. The client called Marcus directly. Marcus called an emergency huddle. Mark tried to explain. The interns tried to explain. Everyone was trying to explain. I sat quietly, hands folded, letting the room fill with the stress they had earned themselves. That evening, I walked past Mark's desk. He was staring at the screens, pale, muttering numbers and dates under his breath. Rachel, he finally said, voice low, not looking up. How does she always notice everything? I didn't answer. I smiled just a little, enough for him to see it, and walked past. Because the cracks were widening, and soon, everyone would see just how deep they went. The following Monday, the office had a different energy. Not quite panic, but the subtle, low-grade tension that makes people second-guess every click of a mouse, every sentence in an email. I arrived early as usual and noticed Mark already at his desk. He was flipping through spreadsheets, muttering numbers, the corners of his mouth tight. Not a good sign. Morning, I said lightly, just to acknowledge him. He barely looked up. Morning, he muttered. I turned to my work, pretending I hadn't noticed the fatigue etching itself into his features. Honestly, it was fascinating. You could see him unraveling in real time, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, in the tiny, almost imperceptible gestures. His chair slightly askew, the repeated opening and closing of files, the subtle tightening of his jaw whenever someone walked by and glanced at his screen. It's the little things, really. That's how a system built on someone else's diligence collapses. Silently, almost imperceptibly, until one day it's a landslide. By mid-morning, the first small catastrophe hit. A client had sent an email that should have gone to Mark's project lead inbox. Instead, it landed in the shared folder. Unfortunately, the spreadsheet formulas hadn't been updated after the handoff. Marcus, one of the analysts said quietly, the client just asked why their deliverables are off. I checked the file, and the dates don't match the schedule. Marcus, already tense from previous complaints, rubbed his temples. Mark glanced at the screen, then back at Marcus. His face went pale. I thought the template had auto-updated. It didn't. I could feel the other's eyes flicking to me as I typed away, pretending to be fully absorbed in my own tasks. My silence was heavier than any words I could have said. One of the newer analysts muttered under her breath, "How is this happening?" No one knew what to answer. Not really. By lunchtime, rumors had started to circulate. Some whispered that I was somehow meddling from the sidelines. Others suggested that Mark was over his head. I let it happen. Let them speculate. Let tension simmer. Because in offices like ours, nothing escalates faster than suspicion. And that was the beauty of it. I didn't have to do anything. The cracks were already widening. Mark tried to cover his mistakes in the afternoon meeting. He was defensive, talking over people, insisting that the errors were minor. But you could see it. He was flustered. "I don't know why this is such a big deal," he said, packing slightly. "The system works fine." Marcus shook his head, tired. "It's failing right now. That's the problem." There was a long pause, everyone looking at each other. Finally, one of the analysts spoke up. "Well, maybe some of the instructions or formulas changed when Rachel left the team. She always handled the checks, you know." The room froze. Mark turned sharply to me, eyes narrowing. "Rachel, did I what?" I asked innocently, keeping my tone calm. "I've been here, just as always, handling my current tasks. Nothing has changed on my end." His face tightened, and I let a fraction of a smile creep across mine. Not smugly, not arrogantly, just enough to remind him silently that I had been the backbone. By the end of the day, the first real client call disaster happened. A misrouted proposal had been sent out with incorrect financial calculations. The client noticed immediately and called Marcus directly. Marcus called an emergency huddle, looking more tense than I had ever seen him. "Mark, explain this," he said sharply. Mark stammered, trying to explain. We followed the process. I checked everything. I watched the team carefully. Nobody dared look at me, because everyone already knew the truth, even if they couldn't articulate it. The interns fumbled through explanations. The analysts glanced at each other nervously, and Marcus sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Finally, I spoke, voice measured. "It looks like the formulas in the proposal template weren't updated after the last system migration. That step was always double-checked when I handled the reports. Everyone looked at me tense, not accusing, just realizing that the absence of my work was the real problem. Later that afternoon, Mark tried to approach me quietly. "Rachel," he muttered, leaning close to my desk. Can you just double-check this? I don't want Marcus to." I looked up, calm as ever. "Mark, I'm happy to answer questions about my current assignments. The system you're using is under your responsibility now." He swallowed hard. Right. And he walked away, shoulders slumping slightly. By Friday, the office atmosphere had shifted entirely. No one laughed anymore. No one made casual jokes at my expense. People whispered. Tension hummed in the air like static electricity. And Marcus, he stopped calling me to ask for updates on minor issues. He was busy trying to figure out why the team he'd promoted to replace me kept slipping. I sat quietly at my desk, reviewing my tasks, observing everything, keeping my face neutral. Because this is how it happens. Small errors, ignored for too long, slowly build into chaos. People panic. They suspect. They scramble. And when the dust settles, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. By the following Monday, the tension in the office had hardened into something you could almost touch. The hum of fluorescent lights above felt oppressive. Phones rang with more urgency. Chairs scraped against tile floors louder than usual. Every email notification carried the weight of potential disaster. Mark was visibly unraveling. His confident stride had become hesitant packing. His usually loud voice had dropped into short, clipped sentences. He spent more time leaning over his keyboard than speaking in meetings. And when he did speak, there was that constant edge, a desperate insistence that everything was under control. No one believed him anymore. I watched from my corner, calm, folding and unfolding documents, pretending I had no stake in the chaos. But every slip, every error, every small breakdown fed the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you were underestimated. "Rachel, can you come here for a second?" Marcus called, beckoning me toward his office. I walked over, neutral, polite, careful not to show the hint of satisfaction curling in my chest. Marcus looked exhausted. Lines of stress etched into his face. He rubbed his forehead and gestured to the screen. "Look at these reports. Deadlines missed, deliverables sent incorrectly, budget discrepancies. Can you help me understand what's going on?" I took a deep breath. The processes themselves aren't broken, Marcus. They're just not being followed. Some steps that were always double-checked are being skipped. Small things overlooked in the rush. He frowned. "Small things." "Yes," I said quietly. "Minor oversights, but they compound quickly. Especially when the team doesn't have the same oversight they had when I handled them." Marcus leaned back, silent, digesting that. I could see the realization forming that maybe, just maybe, the person he'd demoted had been the only one keeping everything afloat. Meanwhile, Mark's frustration was boiling over. In a team meeting, he snapped at the analysts. Why was the delivery schedule off? How does this happen? One of the newer analysts raised a tentative hand. We followed the instructions as they were left, Mark. Maybe what? Mark barked. Maybe what? Maybe some of the steps Rachel always handled weren't completed. The intern said softly, almost whispering. The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioner. Mark's face flushed. I don't know what you mean, he said, voice tight. I stayed quiet, listening, absorbing the subtle tremors of panic spreading across the team. My role was observation now, not intervention. The cracks had widened enough. Now, the stress was doing the work I couldn't do overtly. By mid-afternoon, rumors had started circulating. She's doing something, I overheard one of the senior analysts whisper. No, she would. Well, the timing's too precise. Every project that fails coincides with her not being around. It was fascinating to watch suspicions swirl like smoke in the room. I said nothing, maintained a neutral expression, and let the unease grow. Mark caught snippets of it too. His attempts to maintain control were failing. He began double-checking every report, every template, all while the team started quietly blaming each other. And the more they blamed each other, the faster the environment deteriorated. By Friday, the situation had escalated. Marcus had called an emergency review meeting. The senior leadership team was in the room. Mark was sweating through his shirt, packing, trying to explain. We followed the new procedures exactly, he said, voice high-pitched. Everything was fine before the migration. I don't know how. Fine, one of the directors interrupted sharply. This is not fine. We have missed deadlines, client complaints, and errors piling up. How does that happen if everything is fine? Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. All eyes slowly drifted toward me. I kept my head down at first. Quiet, calm. Marcus finally cleared his throat. Rachel, can you give us a perspective? I took a breath, carefully measured. The systems themselves are sound. The templates, the formulas, the workflows, all of them are correct. The errors are happening because the processes are not being fully followed. Certain oversight steps that were routine are now being missed. I met Mark's eyes briefly, just a flicker, before looking back down at my notes. He looked like he wanted to say something, but couldn't. The room was silent for a moment, everyone processing. Then Marcus leaned back, pinching the bridge of his nose. So, these failures aren't random. They're structural, internal. The systems were fine, the execution failed. Mark swallowed hard. I see. And in that room, you could almost feel the collapse of ego. A leader who had been overconfident, suddenly confronted with the reality that he had never truly controlled anything. That evening, I walked past the team pod and noticed the tension had become almost physical. Phones were picked up hesitantly. Fingers hovered over keyboards like even a single mistake would break everything. Mark's posture was slumped. He wasn't speaking to anyone except to give quick, clipped instructions. And even then, he seemed uncertain. I returned to my desk and continued my tasks, the quiet observer. The calm at the center of a storm they didn't even realize was building. And I knew, in the next week, the cracks would deepen further. The rumors, the tension, and the failing projects were only going to compound. Because once a system built on invisible labor loses its guardian, the consequences become impossible to ignore. By Monday morning, the office was nearly unrecognizable. The air hummed with tension. Keyboards clattered nervously. The soft murmurs of uncertainty replaced the usual casual chatter. People were on edge. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next mistake to surface. Mark was at his desk, hunched over, reviewing client files with an intensity that made the team flinch. His usual bravado had evaporated entirely, replaced by a jittery desperation. Even his voice, usually commanding, was clipped and uncertain. "Rachel," he muttered, not even looking up. Can you just glance over this? I want to make sure nothing's missing." I gave a small, measured nod. "It looks like you're following the steps, Mark. Just double-check the latest entries. Sometimes formulas don't update automatically." He exhaled sharply, muttered a barely audible right, and continued. I returned to my own work, calm as ever, letting the subtle unease in the room settle into place. By mid-morning, another chain reaction began. A routine internal audit flagged discrepancies in multiple client files. Deadlines that were supposed to be synchronized had slipped. Budgets were misaligned. And the interns, who had been trying to maintain composure, were now nervously whispering to each other, glancing toward Marcus's office. Mark paced, checking and rechecking his work, muttering to himself. He even tried calling me over again, this time with more urgency. "Rachel, please, just take a quick look. I can't figure out why the dates are off." I paused, then spoke softly, deliberately measured. "I'm focusing on my current assignments, Mark. Everything in this system is correct. It's just not being followed properly." He froze, realizing my words were not a promise of help, but a statement of fact. And the realization hit him hard. The oversight he had relied on, the invisible guardrail I had always provided, was gone. By the afternoon, whispers had begun circulating outside of the team pod. She must be doing something," one analyst said under their breath. "No," another replied. "I don't think so. It's just, everything is falling apart. You can't tell me it's coincidence. Things never went wrong like this before Rachel was moved." Even the interns had started to glance at me nervously, unsure whether to ask for guidance or stay silent. The tension spread like wildfire. Everyone was exhausted from scrambling to fix cascading mistakes. Emails flew faster, questions piled up, and Mark's posture got sloppier by the hour. Finally, Marcus called an emergency check-in meeting. He looked weary, shoulders slumped, the weight of repeated client complaints pressing down on him. "Mark," he said, voice tight, "this has gone far enough. Explain exactly what happened here." Mark opened his mouth, faltered, then shut it again. His bravado had completely crumbled. All eyes in the room slowly turned toward me. I kept my expression neutral, folding a few papers in my hand, letting the silence linger. Marcus broke it. "Rachel, can you clarify?" I looked up, calm, unwavering. "The system is not broken. The reports, templates, and workflows are functioning exactly as designed. The errors are a result of missed steps that were always double-checked when I handled them." Mark's face paled. His jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but there was nothing he could say. The truth was quietly undeniable. By the end of the day, the team had begun to realize the scope of the problem. Minor mistakes had compounded into a major breakdown of operations. Deadlines had slipped. Clients had complained. And quietly, without anyone needing to point fingers explicitly, everyone understood that my absence from the oversight role was the source of the instability. Mark avoided eye contact with me entirely. He barely spoke, reduced to muttered instructions and defensive posturing, and I sat quietly observing, calm, patient, the silent eye in the center of a storm that others had created themselves. The cracks had widened enough. Now, the collapse was inevitable, and in that slow, methodical unraveling, the first seeds of the exposure were already planted. It started with a single email, not dramatic, not flashy, just a routine internal audit report that flagged inconsistencies across multiple client files. I was reviewing a spreadsheet in my small corner when I noticed it. An alert from the audit system showing errors in 5 separate project files, all tied to dates, formulas, and templates that should have been correct. I didn't need to do anything. The team would see it. The problems were undeniable. A few minutes later, Marcus called a meeting. I knew this wasn't going to be casual. Mark walked in, slightly sweaty, adjusting his tie as if he could physically straighten out the day by doing so. The interns and analysts shuffled papers nervously. I sat quietly at my desk, letting everyone else speak first. "Team," Marcus began, voice tense, "we've had multiple issues reported. Some deadlines missed, client files sent with errors, and budget discrepancies across the board. I need explanations, and I need them now." Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no real answers. His previous confidence had dissolved over the past week, replaced by tight, defensive lines. We followed the processes," he stammered. "I don't understand how these discrepancies—" Marcus interrupted sharply. "Processes? Really, Mark? It seems the processes are being ignored or incomplete. How did this happen? Eyes slowly shifted toward me. I kept my hands folded, calm, collected. The systems themselves are intact. The templates, workflows, and checks are correct. The errors you're seeing are the result of incomplete adherence to the procedures, steps that were always double-checked when I managed them. The room went still. Mark's face paled. That can't be right, he muttered. Yes, I said softly. That's exactly right. The oversight you depended on is no longer present, and the gaps are showing. The mistakes aren't random. They're structural. The tension was palpable. The interns glanced nervously at Mark. Analysts shifted in their chairs. Even Marcus looked strained, like he was absorbing a truth that was long overdue. One of the analysts, voice shaking, finally said, "So, the projects aren't failing because the system is bad. They're failing because the supervision isn't there." I didn't answer beyond my earlier words. The silence did it for me. Mark's hands clenched into fists. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, defeated. By mid-afternoon, rumors of Rachel's oversight were circulating quietly through the office. People whispered in hushed tones, connecting dots they hadn't considered before. She was the one checking everything, one analyst said to another. Yeah, she always caught the errors before they reached the client, the other replied. Mark overheard them and stormed past, muttering about deadlines and schedules. His attempt to regain control had failed. He was visibly rattled. I watched from my desk, calm, letting the truth emerge naturally. No confrontation needed. No shouting. The evidence spoke louder than anyone's voice. Later, Marcus called me privately. "Rachel," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. I think we underestimated your role. You've kept this team functioning for years. And now, it's obvious how much." I nodded, neutral. "I've always focused on my work, Marcus. That's all I ever intended. But the system is built for oversight. Without it, cracks appear." He leaned back, exhausted but thoughtful. "I see that now. I'll be honest, I didn't expect things to fall apart this quickly, but it's undeniable. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The message had been delivered. By Friday, the situation had spilled over to other departments. Clients had noticed inconsistencies. Reports had been delayed. Management meetings were tense, with people quietly acknowledging the collapse. Mark, once loud and overconfident, was now quiet, defensive, and increasingly isolated. The team, caught in the crossfire, was scrambling to patch errors without understanding the root cause. And through it all, I remained calm. I did my job. I watched. I observed. And slowly, the invisible scaffolding I had once provided was being acknowledged, without me having to claim it. The exposure wasn't dramatic or explosive. It didn't need to be. The failure had made itself obvious. And the truth that I had quietly been the stabilizing force was emerging for everyone to see. By the following Monday, Mark was visibly on edge. He moved through the office like a man walking on cracked ice. Each step measured, cautious, terrified of breaking something irreparably. Everyone could sense it, even the interns. The first major public blow came during a client call. Mark was leading it, trying desperately to maintain composure. The client had questions about missing deliverables, conflicting schedules, and mismatched reports. He fumbled through explanations, stumbling over timelines and numbers. I'm not sure why this happened, he admitted finally, voice tight. I'll get back to you immediately with the corrected files. There was silence on the call for a moment, and then the client's disappointment was palpable. Mark, this is the third time this quarter. Click, the call ended. Mark sank into his chair, pale. I watched from my desk, calm, letting the aftermath unfold naturally. Within hours, the rumor mill in the office had gone into overdrive. Rachel must have had something to do with this, whispered one analyst. No, she's just not here like she used to be, said another. Whatever it is, things never failed like this before, murmured an intern. Mark overheard these whispers. His attempts to appear composed were failing. He was visibly frustrated, muttering under his breath, checking files repeatedly, and emailing frantic clarifications. It was mesmerizing to watch, not because I took pleasure in his discomfort, but because the collapse was inevitable. The system had been fine. The structure had been sound. But without the subtle oversight I had provided, errors compounded, spiraling quietly yet relentlessly. Marcus called another meeting in the afternoon. This is serious, he said firmly, scanning the room. Client complaints are escalating. We need clarity on why this is happening. Mark tried to speak, but no one listened. His words, once commanding, were now dismissed as excuses. I stayed silent at first. Then, calmly, I said, the system is intact. The templates, workflows, and checks are functioning. The errors are a result of skipped oversight steps. Tasks that were always double-checked when I managed them are now going unchecked. A heavy pause followed, Mark's face drained of color. Marcus leaned back, rubbing his temples. The truth was obvious. Everyone could see it now. By the end of the day, the fallout had reached everyone in the department. Emails piled up. Deadlines were missed. Analysts panicked. The interns whispered behind closed doors. And Mark, he became increasingly defensive, snapping at anyone who questioned his work, yet unable to correct the underlying problems. Every glance in my direction was charged with tension. A mix of fear, suspicion, and recognition, because now the quiet truth had surfaced. The collapse was a result of his own incompetence. The work I had done quietly for years had kept everything stable. The moment I was removed, the cracks revealed themselves, undeniable and inescapable. That night, as the office emptied, I lingered at my desk, reviewing my own tasks. Mark passed by, shoulders slumped, eyes darting nervously toward me. "Rachel, do you think there's anything I can do to fix this?" I looked at him, calm, measured. "Follow the steps carefully. Double-check everything. The system works. It's the execution that's failing." He nodded silently, defeated, and walked away. The exposure wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting match, no confrontation. It was subtle, quiet, and undeniable. The kind of truth that, once seen, can't be ignored. And I knew the final stage was coming. The part where the consequences of their underestimation would be complete. By midweek, the office atmosphere had shifted completely. It wasn't just tension anymore. It was a quiet panic, the hum of computers, the shuffle of papers, even the soft murmur of voices carried a weight that hadn't existed before. Every glance seemed loaded with accusation. Every pause stretched longer than it should. Mark was unraveling visibly. He no longer attempted to lead with confidence. His words were clipped, often defensive, and he spent more time double-checking spreadsheets than addressing the team. The interns were whispering, nervously asking each other if they had done something wrong. Analysts glanced at me subtly, as though hoping I'd intervene, and I didn't. I didn't need to. It started with another client complaint. A project proposal had been sent with conflicting financial data. The client called Marcus directly, frustrated and confused. Marcus, exhausted from dealing with the mounting issues, called an emergency meeting. Mark tried to explain. The template was, it should have been correct. I don't know what. Marcus cut him off sharply. You do know. How does this keep happening? The room went silent. Everyone was waiting. I spoke, calm and deliberate. The templates are correct. The errors are a result of skipped verification steps, steps that were consistently applied when I managed the workflow. Mark's face went pale. His mouth opened and closed like he was searching for words that wouldn't come. The room absorbed it, quietly, uncomfortably. No one dared argue. By the afternoon, the whispers had become audible. She must be behind all this somehow. One analyst murmured to another. I don't think so. It's just that things never failed like this before, the other replied. Mark overheard, frustration mounting, but he was too rattled to respond. His attempts to assert control were failing. The tension had taken on a life of its own. Marcus, meanwhile, was visibly exhausted, rubbing his forehead and sighing repeatedly. The realization that their previously smooth-running department had been dependent on one person, me, was dawning. Then came the turning point. An internal audit report, flagged for client discrepancies, was circulated to the leadership team. The errors were undeniable, systemic, and directly tied to the processes Mark had failed to maintain. Everyone looked at him. Mark's face was a mask of frustration, shame, and helplessness. He tried to explain, but it was clear the room wasn't listening. I remained calm, hands folded, expression neutral. The exposure wasn't a spectacle. It was quiet, clinical, unavoidable. By the end of the day, the hierarchy had shifted subtly, but permanently. Marcus no longer relied on Mark for explanations. Analysts and interns adjusted their workflows, hesitantly asking questions about procedures I had designed. And Mark, he became increasingly isolated, defensive, and aware that the failures were on him, even if he couldn't fully admit it yet. I continued my work, quietly, calmly, observing. The exposure wasn't about shouting or confrontation. It was about letting the truth emerge naturally, undeniable in its clarity. And as I left the office that evening, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The team had underestimated me. The system had failed without my oversight. And now, the consequences were visible for everyone to see. The cracks had widened, the exposure was complete, and the stage was set. The following Monday, the office felt different, not just tense or panicked. This was heavier, sharper, like a storm had passed and left everyone exposed. People moved quietly, eyes flicking to Mark, then to me, then to each other. Even the interns were unusually silent, their previous nervous energy replaced by a tense awareness of the consequences they had been part of. Mark arrived first, hunched over his desk, papers scattered around him. He avoided eye contact with anyone, muttering numbers under his breath. His usual arrogance was gone, completely. "Morning," I said lightly, sitting down at my desk. He barely responded, just a tight nod. I didn't care. He knew why I was calm. The projects he had once led with overconfidence were now in disarray. Deadlines had been missed. Client complaints were piling up, and every small misstep that he had ignored over the past weeks had finally become visible. And yet, despite the chaos, I stayed silent. Observation was my power. Patience had its own authority. By mid-morning, the first confrontation happened. Marcus called an impromptu meeting in the conference room. The senior team filed in, looking grim. Analysts whispered quietly among themselves. Mark shuffled papers nervously, trying to maintain composure, failing completely. Marcus began, voice controlled but tense. "I've reviewed the client reports, the deliverables, and the internal audits. There are systemic failures across multiple projects. Can you explain why this is happening?" Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. His jaw tightened. He was trying to think, trying to speak, but the words failed him. I stayed seated, calm. I let the silence grow. It wasn't cruelty, it was inevitability. Finally, I spoke, quietly, clearly. "The systems themselves are not broken," I said. "Templates, workflows, checks, all of them are functioning as designed. The errors are a result of missed steps that were always double-checked when I managed them." The room went still. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the slight shuffling of papers, the soft exhale of exasperation. Mark's face drained of color. His mouth moved as if to respond, but no sound came. Marcus leaned back, rubbing his temples. So, these failures aren't random. They're a direct result of oversight not being applied. Yes, I said softly. Exactly. Whispers spread instantly. Analysts glanced at each other. Interns looked nervous, and Marcus's eyes were locked on me, a mixture of relief and disbelief. Mark slumped in his chair, his hands clenched and unclenched. He had tried to maintain control, but now the truth was undeniable, and the quiet satisfaction I felt wasn't about revenge in the dramatic sense. It was about the clarity of inevitability. The system had failed without the invisible guardrail I had always provided. And finally, everyone could see it. By late afternoon, the consequences became public within the company. An internal email circulated to department heads, summarizing project delays, client complaints, and the chain of errors that had caused them. While no names were called, the subtext was clear. Mark's confidence was gone. Analysts were adjusting their methods, finally acknowledging the systems I had implemented. Marcus called one-on-one meetings to understand how oversight had been maintained before, and slowly, the office hierarchy was adjusting itself back to reality. Mark no longer approached me with questions. He avoided eye contact, muttering instructions to interns, desperately trying to regain authority he no longer possessed. And I continued my work quietly, calmly, watching as the consequences of underestimation unfolded naturally. By midweek, Mark's unraveling had become impossible to ignore. He stumbled through every task. Client reports contained errors he overlooked. Meetings became uncomfortable exercises in avoidance. Every time someone asked a question, his responses were defensive, clipped, and visibly panicked. Even the interns, who had been hesitant to challenge him before, now quietly questioned his instructions. The team was fractured. Analysts whispered corrections to one another before even attempting to notify him. Miscommunication, once minor, had multiplied, and every failure reflected directly back on him. The breaking point came during a client presentation. Mark was leading, but the errors in the slides were obvious. Numbers didn't match reports. Charts contradicted budgets. The client's disappointment was immediate and sharp. "Mark, this is not acceptable," the client said. "These errors are repeated, and we've already raised concerns in previous meetings." "What's happening internally?" Mark's face went pale. He tried to explain, but his words stumbled over themselves. I don't know. The process was followed. The client cut him off. Clearly it was. Click, the call ended. Mark sank into his chair, shaking slightly. He had reached the limit of control he could exert over a team that no longer trusted him. A team now quietly aware of the truth I had held in balance for years. Back in the office, whispers spread rapidly. "She's the only one keeping things under control," one analyst said softly. "Everything fell apart the second she was demoted," another replied. I never realized how much she did," admitted a junior team member. Mark overheard. His frustration was barely contained. He walked past me, muttering under his breath, hands clenched, muttering numbers and deadlines, as if repeating them could restore order. I didn't flinch. I continued my work, calm, observant. Patience had been my ally. The chaos was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. By Thursday, Marcus called a private meeting. "Rachel," he said quietly, closing the door, "the department is in disarray. I don't know how we underestimated your role. Your absence is glaringly obvious. How did we not notice before?" I looked up, calm, precise. "The system works. The processes are sound. The oversight was the critical factor, the one step everyone relied on without realizing it." Marcus leaned back, sighing. "I see that now. I'll be honest, this is all painfully clear." I nodded silently. No words were needed beyond the obvious truth. By the end of the week, the exposure was complete. Mark's authority had eroded. Analysts and interns adjusted their workflows without him. Clients received corrections and clarifications. Marcus began instituting changes that acknowledged the gaps in oversight. And through it all, I remained calm. I did my work. I observed. I let the consequences unfold naturally. The reckoning had arrived. Mark had underestimated me. The system had failed without the guidance he assumed unnecessary. And now, the collapse was undeniable. By Friday, the office felt like a different place, entirely. The air was taut, charged with a quiet awareness that nothing would ever be the same. Analysts whispered in corners. Interns moved cautiously, and even Marcus walked with a careful deliberation, aware of the truth that had been ignored for far too long. Mark was a shadow of himself. Gone was the loud confidence, the bravado that had dominated meetings. He avoided eye contact, muttered under his breath, and scrolled endlessly through spreadsheets, trying desperately to regain control of a department slipping further from his grasp with every passing hour. The final confrontation came quietly, almost anticlimactically. Marcus called a full team meeting. Everyone filed in, some fidgeting, some trying to mask relief that they weren't the target this time. Mark took his place at the head of the table, shoulders slumped. "This department has seen repeated errors over the past few weeks," Marcus began, voice steady but sharp. "Client dissatisfaction is rising, and internal processes have collapsed. I need clarity now." Mark opened his mouth, faltered, and closed it again. I sat at my desk, calm, folding a few papers. Then I spoke, measured and deliberate. "The systems themselves are correct. Workflows, templates, checks, all of them function as designed. The errors you've experienced are the result of skipped oversight steps that were always double-checked when I managed them. Execution, not the system, is the problem. The room went still. Even the interns held their breath. Mark's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. His authority, once assumed, was now publicly undone. Over the next few hours, the consequences played out in real time. Analysts quietly adjusted their workflows, double-checking every step. The interns began following protocols I had designed long ago, their confidence slowly returning as the chaos receded. Marcus implemented corrective measures, acknowledging the gaps in oversight that had been ignored. And Mark, he sat slumped in his chair, watching as the department he had believed he led crumbled around him. His frustration, anger, and shame were all visible, yet he could not reverse the course that had been set weeks ago. Every glance in my direction was heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. The person he had underestimated had quietly been the backbone of it all. Later that evening, the office emptied slowly. Mark passed by my desk. His voice was low, almost breaking. "Rachel, how did you?" I looked up calm, letting a faint smile touch my lips. "I didn't do anything. The system works. It just needed to be followed." He said nothing, just walked away, defeated. And I returned to my work, quietly, steadily. The reckoning was complete. The team had underestimated me. The system had failed without my guidance. The exposure was undeniable. And the office, the projects, the deadlines, the workflows, had all returned to stability, because the invisible work I had always done was finally recognized. No one needed to shout. No dramatic confrontation was necessary. The truth had revealed itself quietly, sharply, and irrevocably. And in that quiet, I reclaimed control, not by force, but by patience, observation, and the inevitability of justice.